They told Margaret she was too old for love, too old for butterflies, too old for second chances. At 52, with silver in her hair and grief in her bones, she believed them. Samuel believed it too. At 48, he'd already had his great love story and watched it end in a cemetery. So when they married in that small Oregon chapel, it wasn't for romance, it wasn't for passion, it was a business arrangement, a merger of two broken lives. But here's the thing about broken things. Sometimes, when you put two of them together, they become whole again. Oregon, Millwood Township, autumn of 1888. The church was small, cold, silent. The light filtering through the windows was pale, as if even the sun hesitated to witness this marriage. Margaret Green stood in the doorway, hands clasped in front of her, smoothing the edges of her gray dress. She was 52 years old. Silver had woven through her hair, but it was still neat, still proper. Lines marked her face, each one a story, each one a loss. The church was empty. Only the priest, one witness, and the man standing across from her. Samuel Harding. 48 years old, broad-shouldered, beard streaked with gray, hands calloused from work. He wore a gray suit too, but the sleeves were slightly short, as if it had belonged to someone else. The priest opened his book and asked his questions. Margaret answered, her voice flat and distant. When she spoke the words "I do," she closed her eyes. In her mind appeared another church, another wedding. Henry's laughter, the scent of fresh flowers, the excitement of young hearts. Then she opened her eyes and returned to reality. Samuel answered the priest as well. There was a hoarseness in his voice. His eyes were cast down. Catherine's face appeared in his mind. His wife who died in childbirth. His wife who left with their baby. 4 years had passed, but she still haunted his dreams. The priest closed his book and declared them husband and wife. No one applauded, because no one was there. Margaret and Samuel looked at each other. They didn't kiss. They simply bowed their heads and left the church. Samuel's cabin sat outside of town, close to the forest, alone. Wood, small, 2 rooms. From the outside it looked like a home. From the inside it was a nightmare. Margaret stepped across the threshold. She picked up her suitcase and entered. The cabin was dark, dusty, abandoned. The stove was cold. The table was dirty. In the corner, a chair lay tipped over. Samuel followed her in silently. He pointed upstairs and told her that would be hers. He would stay below. The words were cold and practical, like a business transaction. Margaret climbed the stairs. Her room was even smaller. A bed, a window, a closet. Through the window she could see the forest. She sat on the edge of the bed. Then she saw it. A photograph on the wall, framed, old, faded. A woman, young, beautiful, smiling. Below it, a name. Catherine. Margaret stared at that photograph for a long time. Then she opened her suitcase. From the very bottom she pulled out a photograph. Henry's photograph, young, strong, clean-shaven, taken the day he'd lifted her into his arms. Margaret placed the photograph beside the bed. She turned off the light. She lay down. But she didn't sleep. Downstairs, Samuel had also lain down. In his hand was another photograph, Catherine's. He looked at it, looked for a long time. Then he pressed it to his chest and wept silently. That night, 2 widows slept with 2 ghosts. Days passed. Margaret and Samuel lived in the same house, but didn't share the same life. In the mornings, Margaret rose early. She made coffee, baked bread. Samuel went outside, chopped wood, mended fences. At lunch they sat at the table. They spoke little, asking for salt, offering thanks. And then silence returned. In the evenings, Margaret sewed. Samuel sat by the stove. Sometimes he read, sometimes he just stared at the fire. Margaret didn't look at him, but she knew. Samuel wasn't looking at her either. They were both there, but they were both somewhere else. One evening, Margaret found the courage to ask about Catherine. Samuel froze. He closed his book. He didn't answer for a long time. Then, in a low voice, he told her that Catherine had been good. She'd been kind. She'd laughed a lot. Then he asked Margaret if she ever spoke of Henry. Margaret nodded. She said Henry had been good too, strong. He'd made her feel safe. Samuel looked at her, really looked for the first time. He said that Margaret still loved Henry. Margaret confirmed it. Then she added that Samuel still loved Catherine too. Samuel admitted it. Then they both fell silent, and that silence was heavier than anything, because that silence asked a question. So what will become of us? Winter came early that year. Snow fell, wind blew, the air turned bitter cold. One morning when Margaret stepped outside, she slipped on the icy steps. Her ankle twisted, she cried out in pain and fell to the ground. Her wrist was already beginning to swell. Samuel came out of the cabin and found her there, on the ground, groaning in pain but not crying. He panicked, because Catherine had also been in pain once, during childbirth, and Samuel had been able to do nothing. Margaret saw the panic on his face. She told him she was fine, but Samuel seemed not to hear. He stood frozen, motionless. Margaret said it again, more clearly this time. She was fine, it was just a sprain. Samuel slowly approached. He helped her, took her arm, lifted her to her feet. His hands were trembling. He apologized, said he'd just been so afraid. Margaret told him she understood. She knew. That night Samuel cooked for her, for the first time. Soup, bread, tea. When they sat at the table, Samuel asked how Henry had died. Margaret swallowed. She told him Henry had fallen from a horse. His neck had broken. He'd died instantly. Her eyes filled. She said that she'd been the one to suggest the riding race that day. She still blamed herself. Samuel leaned forward. He told her it wasn't her fault. Margaret looked at him and said Catherine's death wasn't his fault either. Samuel went quiet. Then he nodded. For the first time in 4 years, someone had said that to him. One morning while cleaning the closet, Margaret found a box. Inside were letters, Catherine's letters, love letters she'd written to Samuel before their marriage. Margaret didn't read them, but she saw. Samuel still kept them. That same day, Samuel found a trunk in the attic. Henry's belongings, his hat, his belt, the harmonica he'd played while singing. Margaret still hadn't thrown them away. That evening, they both ate dinner in silence. Finally, Samuel asked if Margaret would ever love him. Margaret was surprised. Samuel explained. He still loved Catherine. Margaret still loved Henry. So what would become of them? Margaret thought for a long time. Then she said, maybe they didn't need to forget them. Maybe they could carry them alongside, but still learn to move forward. Samuel looked at her and asked how. Margaret said she didn't know, but they could try. As days passed, small things changed. Samuel began making Margaret coffee in the mornings. Margaret mended Samuel's torn jacket. Samuel picked flowers for Margaret, wild, small, but a gesture. Margaret made Samuel's favorite dessert. One evening a snowstorm began. The roof was leaking. Samuel climbed up to repair it. Margaret held the ladder. The wind was fierce. Samuel slipped, nearly fell. Margaret shouted, told him to hold on. Samuel held on. He climbed down, breathing hard. Margaret threw her arms around him. For the first time, she held him. She cried that he'd nearly died, tears streaming down her face. Samuel was shocked, but he held her. He told her he was fine. Margaret rested her head on his shoulder. She told him she didn't want to lose him. Samuel stopped. His heart raced. But Margaret loved Henry. Margaret said Henry was dead. Her voice trembled. She would always love him. But Samuel was here, and she didn't want to lose him. Samuel closed his eyes. For the first time in 4 years, someone had said something like that to him. One day Margaret took down Catherine's photograph from the wall. When Samuel came home, he saw and asked why. Margaret turned. She said she didn't want to live in Catherine's shadow anymore. She was sure Catherine had been a good woman, a wonderful wife. But she was Margaret. And she was here. Samuel swallowed. He apologized. He said he'd never tried to make Margaret into Catherine. Margaret said she knew. But maybe it was time they both accepted it was time to let go of the past. Samuel nodded. Then he went to his room. He took Catherine's photograph from the drawer. He kissed it. He whispered that he wouldn't forget her. Then he placed the photograph in a box and put it deep in the closet. Margaret did the same. She put Henry's photograph in her suitcase, but she didn't throw it away, because some things aren't forgotten. They're just carried alongside. When spring came, Samuel did something Margaret never expected. He proposed. Again. Margaret said in confusion that they were already married. Samuel said no. They were married on paper, but he wanted to truly marry her, by choosing her. Samuel asked Margaret seriously, would she marry him this time for love? Margaret's eyes filled. She asked if he was serious. Samuel confirmed it. Margaret smiled. She smiled through tears. Yes, she said, she would marry him. This time the wedding was different. A small ceremony, but full. A few neighbors, a priest, flowers. Margaret didn't wear a white dress, but her face glowed. Samuel looked at her, his eyes wet. The priest asked Margaret, and she said she accepted with her whole heart. The priest asked Samuel, and he said he accepted with his whole heart, and they kissed. For the first time, a real kiss, long, deep, full. A year later, Margaret and Samuel sat on the porch. The sun was setting, the sky was orange. Margaret touched Samuel's hand. Margaret said that her first husband had taught her about love, but Samuel had taught her how to love again. Samuel looked at her. He smiled. He said Margaret had taught him that life wasn't over. They both fell silent. Then Samuel asked if they still thought about Catherine and Henry. Margaret said yes and asked him the same. Samuel said yes too. Margaret said that was good, because they were the ones who'd brought them here today. Samuel rested his head on her shoulder. He told her he loved her. Margaret said it back. And that evening, the two widows didn't leave their two ghosts behind. They carried them alongside. Because sometimes love isn't about forgetting. Sometimes love is about honoring the past while stepping into the future. 1895, 7 years later. Margaret was 59, Samuel 55. They still lived in that cabin. On the porch sat two chairs. Both had names carved into them, Margaret and Samuel. One day a neighbor asked how they'd become so happy. Margaret smiled. She said they both knew how to lose. And when you lose, you understand the value of what you find afterward. Samuel added that love doesn't come just once. Sometimes, if you're lucky, it comes twice, and the second time can be more beautiful. Because this time, you know how precious it is. That day, the sun set. But the lights in the cabin still burned bright. Love has no age. Love has no end. Sometimes love begins in youth, sometimes in maturity. Sometimes it ends with a first love. Sometimes it begins with a second. What matters is this: love, if you let it, always finds a way.